He beat the biggest men in bodybuilding history, then vanished from the spotlight. What really happened to Frank Zane? For 3 straight years, he stood at the very top of the sport, a 3-time Mr. Olympia whose physique was so precise, so perfectly balanced that they called him the Chemist. But just as quickly as he rose, his reign crumbled, leaving fans wondering how a man who once defined aesthetics could disappear so suddenly. This is the untold story of Frank Zane, his rise to glory, the struggles that nearly destroyed him, the rumors that still follow his name, and the life he built after walking away from the stage. But behind the fame was a story no one expected, one of pain, philosophy, and choices that changed everything. The rise of the Chemist. They called him the Chemist, not because he spent his nights buried in bottles and powders, but because of the way he approached bodybuilding itself. Zane dissected training like a science experiment. Every rep was measured, every set carefully logged, every tweak to his nutrition recorded like data in a lab book. He wasn't chasing chaos in the gym, he was chasing precision. For Frank Zane, the weight room wasn't a dungeon. It was a laboratory, and his body was the ultimate experiment. Through the 1960s and 70s, he worked his way through the ranks with quiet determination, first dominating in the AAU, then carving his place in the IFBB. Unlike some of his peers who stormed onto the scene in a blaze of publicity, Zane built his reputation step by step, trophy by trophy, until he could no longer be ignored. And what made him impossible to overlook wasn't size, it was shape. In an era when bodybuilders were swelling into giants, Zane was carving a new standard, razor-sharp lines, flawless symmetry, and a proportion that made even his smaller frame appear commanding. He wasn't the biggest, but when he posed under the lights, he looked untouchable, a living statue. While others aimed to overwhelm, Zane aimed to perfect. Offstage, though, his life was far from the chaos of bodybuilding's golden age. By day, he stood in front of a chalkboard as a math and chemistry teacher, breaking down equations for students who had no idea their quiet instructor was also building one of the greatest physiques in history. At night, he transformed, sculpting his body with the discipline of a monk. The contrast was surreal. In the classroom, he was explaining formulas. In the gym, he was applying them to himself. This unique blend of intellect and artistry made him stand out, and not always in a good way. Within bodybuilding circles, Zane was respected, but also seen as different. He wasn't the loudest, the flashiest, or the most reckless. He was cerebral, strategic, and almost academic in a world that celebrated brute force. And that difference brought him into quiet conflict with the most powerful man in bodybuilding, Joe Weider. Weider had a vision for the sport, one filled with freakish size, shock value, and spectacle. He was promoting mass monsters, bodies so enormous they almost looked alien. Zane represented the opposite. His version of bodybuilding was art, not circus. A masterpiece, not a sideshow. This divide between philosophy and promotion wasn't just theoretical. It would shape Zane's entire career, his victories, his struggles, and eventually the cracks in his reign. By the late 1970s, Frank Zane had transformed from the quiet schoolteacher with a dream into the man standing at the very top of bodybuilding. His scientific, almost surgical approach to training and diet wasn't just working, it was dominating. In 1977, Zane stunned the world by capturing his first Mr. Olympia title. For the first time, the Sandow Trophy wasn't going to the biggest man in the room, it was going to the most complete. At a time when competitors were packing on 240 and 250 pounds of muscle, Zane walked on stage at under 190 pounds. He didn't tower over anyone. He didn't overwhelm with sheer size. Instead, he looked like something sculpted by Michelangelo. Lean, balanced, and so sharply conditioned that even the judges couldn't deny him. His win sent a message that shook the sport. Symmetry and aesthetics could conquer raw mass. Zane proved it wasn't a fluke by returning in 1978 and defending his title. By then, the fans began to see him as something rare, a bodybuilder who wasn't a freak but an ideal. When he stepped on stage, the lines, the proportions, the tiny waist, and the classic V-taper made him look like the embodiment of the golden ratio. And then came 1979, his masterpiece. Many still say it was the finest version of Zane ever seen. Razor-sharp conditioning, bronze skin glowing under the lights, every pose hitting with mathematical precision. It was the ultimate expression of his philosophy, proof of his now famous line, "Size doesn't matter, aesthetics do." But Zane's Olympia reign wasn't uncontested. He had rivals, dangerous ones. He took the title from Franco Columbu, Arnold's closest ally and a man built like a bull. He clashed with Mike Mentzer, whose brutal intensity and near-mythical heavy-duty training program made him a rising star. And always, lingering in the background, was Arnold Schwarzenegger, the shadow that never really left bodybuilding, even in retirement. Yet Frank Zane wasn't trying to be Arnold. He wasn't trying to be the biggest, the loudest, or the most dominant personality in the room. His appeal was something entirely different. While Arnold embodied power and charisma, Zane embodied art. He was attainable perfection, a body men admired not because it looked superhuman, but because it looked like an ideal they could imagine for themselves. He was proof that bodybuilding didn't have to be about excess. It could be about refinement, balance, and beauty. For 3 golden years, Frank Zane redefined what it meant to be the best in the world. But standing on the summit is dangerous, because just as he had shocked the world with his rise, fate had its own shock waiting for him. At the very top, a single accident changed everything. The summer of 1980 should have been Frank Zane's crowning moment. 3 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles had already secured his place in history, but he was hungry for more. This was supposed to be his 4th victory, the one that would silence any doubts about his dominance and prove that a man under 200 pounds could rule bodybuilding for good. But fate, as it often does in stories of greatness, had other plans. Just weeks before the competition, disaster struck. In what seemed like a routine moment, Zane slipped and crashed into a pool railing. The impact wasn't just painful, it was devastating. He ended up in the hospital, his body bruised and battered, and his meticulously calculated preparation for Olympia shattered. The timing couldn't have been worse. In a sport where the smallest flaw can cost you everything, Zane was suddenly fighting not for dominance, but just to step on stage. Yet, true to his character, Zane refused to quit. He showed up in Sydney, Australia, for the 1980 Mr. Olympia, but this was not the same man who had stunned the world in '79. His frame carried the scars of his accident, his muscle fullness wasn't the same, and his legendary razor-sharp conditioning had slipped. To the fans who had seen him in peak form, it was obvious. Frank Zane wasn't 100%. But as it turned out, his injuries weren't going to be the most controversial part of the night. That year, Arnold Schwarzenegger stunned the bodybuilding world by walking onto the Olympia stage for a surprise comeback. Officially retired and focused on Hollywood, Arnold had not been preparing with the relentless discipline of Zane or Mike Mentzer, and yet his very presence shifted the energy of the event. Suddenly, it didn't feel like a fair contest. It felt like a show built for Arnold. The results sparked one of the darkest controversies in bodybuilding history. Arnold was crowned the winner, but the decision was met with immediate outrage. Mike Mentzer erupted in protest. Other competitors voiced their anger, and fans left the event furious. Many argued the outcome had been rigged, that politics and favoritism had decided the champion rather than the physiques on stage. And caught in the middle of this storm was Frank Zane. Injured, out of his best shape, yet still managing to finish 3rd, he became the overlooked casualty of the scandal. To this day, countless fans argue that even at less than 100%, Zane had the aesthetics to claim his 4th Sandow. Instead, the Olympia of 1980 became remembered not for his resilience, but for its corruption. The fallout was brutal. For Zane, the defeat wasn't just about losing a title. It was about watching the sport he loved transform before his eyes. A new era was beginning, one driven not by symmetry and proportion, but by mass and shock value. The age of the aesthetic champion was dying, replaced by freakish size. The kind of perfection Frank Zane represented was suddenly out of step with bodybuilding's future. But if the bodybuilding world thought Frank Zane would bow out quietly, they were wrong. What happened next shocked everyone. Zane refused to play along. The shockwaves of the 1980 Olympia didn't end when Arnold raised the Sandow. For Frank Zane, and for many competitors who felt robbed that night, the decision wasn't just questionable, it was unforgivable. To Zane, the contest had been compromised. Years of discipline and artistry had been brushed aside by politics and spectacle. The very soul of bodybuilding felt tainted. So in 1981, Zane made a move few champions would ever risk. He refused to compete. Alongside other top athletes, he boycotted the Mr. Olympia entirely, sending a clear message that he would not endorse what he saw as corruption. For Zane, who had built his entire identity on balance, precision, and fairness, stepping onto that stage would have been hypocrisy. This was his silent protest, a stand that showed he valued principle more than another paycheck or headline. By 1982, though, Zane's fire to compete had not completely gone out. The controversy of the Arnold comeback was beginning to fade, and fans wondered, could the Chemist rise again? When he returned to the Olympia stage, he did so with his trademark discipline. His waist was still impossibly tight, his symmetry still flawless, his stage presence still commanding. He pushed hard, grinding against the new wave of mass that was reshaping the sport, and walked away with a respectable second-place finish behind Chris Dickerson. But for those who knew Zane, it was clear something had shifted. The sport was chasing a new ideal. Bigger, thicker, heavier, and even Zane at his sharpest could not hold back the tide. His brand of artistry was being overshadowed by brute size. Then came 1983, the year that truly ended the dream. While preparing for yet another attempt at Olympia glory, Zane was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. The injuries were brutal, derailing not only his comeback but his confidence. Recovery meant lost time, lost muscle, and lost momentum in a sport where every detail mattered. For a man who had always relied on razor-sharp precision and control, the accident was devastating. The fine-tuned machine he had built over decades now carried scars that no amount of posing could hide. By the mid-1980s, Frank Zane made the decision that every legend eventually faces. He stepped away from the stage. His time as a serious contender was over. The bodybuilding world he left behind was no longer the one he had shaped. Mass monsters were taking over, their physiques bigger and bulkier than anything Zane ever aimed to achieve. His era of symmetry and classical beauty was giving way to an age of sheer freakish power. But Frank Zane was never destined to fade into the background. Even away from the stage, he refused to disappear quietly. Life after competition. Stepping away from the Olympia stage didn't mean stepping away from bodybuilding. For Frank Zane, the end of competition was not the end of his mission. It was simply the start of a new chapter. He had spent decades perfecting a philosophy built on symmetry, discipline, and precision, and retirement gave him the opportunity to pass that philosophy on to others. Out of the spotlight, he created the Zane Experience, later known as Zane Haven, a training retreat where fans and aspiring athletes could learn directly from the legend himself. These weren't boot camps designed to pump you up with sheer weight and ego. They were intimate, carefully structured sessions focused on control, proportion, and the deeper connection between mind and muscle. For Zane, it wasn't about building the biggest body in the room. It was about sculpting the most harmonious one. People who trained with him didn't just leave with sore muscles. They left with a new way of looking at their bodies and their lives. But Zane didn't stop there. He turned his ideas into words, becoming one of the most prolific authors in bodybuilding. His books, The Zane Way to a Beautiful Body, Zane Bodybuilding Manual, Mind, Body, Spirit, and others, became staples for those who wanted more than cookie-cutter workout plans. They combined training and nutrition with psychology, visualization, and even spirituality. In a world obsessed with biceps and chest size, Zane was writing about meditation, breathing, and self-mastery. He wasn't just teaching bodybuilding, he was teaching philosophy disguised as fitness. Slowly, Zane built an empire. Not a loud, flashy one, but one rooted in his principles. While many of his contemporaries paid the price for chasing extreme size, enduring health crises, surgeries, and shortened careers, Zane aged differently. He remained lean, healthy, and sharp, a walking advertisement for sustainability in a sport that often destroys its stars. His very existence became proof that his path had been the right one. And he didn't stay silent about what had happened to bodybuilding since his time. Zane openly criticized the sport's obsession with extreme drug use, ballooning size, and physiques that looked more monstrous than human. In interviews, he lamented how bodybuilding had lost its artistry, saying that what was once beautiful had turned into something grotesque. To him, modern champions had traded harmony for shock value, and the sport had become a circus. Yet Zane also saw a glimmer of hope. When the Classic Physique division emerged decades later, designed to reward symmetry, flow, and aesthetics rather than just sheer bulk, he praised it. For Zane, it was a sign that the sport was remembering its roots, the very roots he had embodied on the Olympia stage. Even into his later years, Frank Zane never abandoned the lifestyle that had defined him. He still trained daily, but his training looked different than the heavy iron battles of his youth. Now it was a combination of weights, stretching, meditation, and breathing techniques. He spoke often about the power of visualization, the same tool he had used to sculpt his legendary physique. To Zane, bodybuilding was never just about the body. It was about the mind that controlled it. But while Zane carried on with this quiet, disciplined life, the outside world wasn't always so quiet. Rumors began swirling. For a man who built his career on precision and discipline, Frank Zane's life after competition has been anything but free from speculation. Over the years, the bodybuilding community has never stopped talking about him, and not always in flattering ways. More than once, rumors spread online claiming that Zane had passed away. Headlines, social media posts, and whispered conversations in gyms around the world declared his death, only for him to reappear in interviews or photos alive and well. These false alarms became almost a tradition, a strange reminder of how legendary his name still was, and how much the community couldn't let him go. Then came the accusations. Some critics argued that despite his scientific image and his reputation as a master of proportion, Zane leaned far more heavily on steroids than he ever admitted. His nickname, the Chemist, didn't help. For some, it became proof of an obsession with performance enhancers rather than the methodical training he claimed defined his career. To this day, debates rage over whether Zane's physique was built more by discipline and intellect or by chemistry and secrecy. Others have criticized how his career was treated by the bodybuilding establishment. Was Zane overlooked after 1980 because he refused to embrace the freak size era that Joe Weider was pushing? Some even suggest he was quietly blackballed for not fitting the marketing agenda, a champion who represented art when the industry wanted spectacle. Among fans, the arguments never end. Was Zane underrated? A man decades ahead of his time whose physique would dominate today's Classic Physique division? Or was he simply lucky, competing in the gap years between Arnold's retirement and the rise of the true mass monsters like Lee Haney and Dorian Yates? Depending on who you ask, Zane was either the ultimate artist or an anomaly who held the title while giants were briefly absent. And then there are the questions about his health. Bodybuilding takes a toll, and Zane endured his share of injuries, from his pool accident to the motorcycle crash. Speculation often swirls about how his body held up after years of training, dieting, and supplementation. Yet despite all the whispers, Frank Zane today appears remarkably healthy, sharp, and strong well into his 70s, a testament perhaps that his way really was the sustainable one. So after everything, the victories, the scandals, the rumors, what really happened to Frank Zane? Frank Zane's story didn't end when the Sandow stopped coming. If anything, that was when the deeper part of his legacy began. The trophies, impressive as they were temporary markers in time. What outlasted them was his philosophy, the belief that bodybuilding was never meant to be a contest of who could get the biggest, but a pursuit of harmony, proportion, and the elusive mind-muscle connection. Where others saw lifting as brute force, Zane saw it as a language, a dialogue between discipline and design. While many champions of his era slowly faded into history, remembered only by their Olympia placements, Zane's approach became something greater, a blueprint. His methods, his principles, and his philosophy influenced not just competitors, but generations of athletes, trainers, and even casual lifters who wanted to build something beautiful, not monstrous. That influence came full circle decades later, with the rise of the Classic Physique division. Designed specifically to reward symmetry, balance, and aesthetics, it felt almost like the sport admitting that Zane had been right all along. For years, bodybuilding had pushed itself into extremes, chasing mass until it became unrecognizable. But to truly evolve, it had to circle back to the artistry Zane had embodied on stage. He had planted the seed, and Classic Physique was the sport finally letting it grow. This is why Zane stands shoulder to shoulder with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Franco Columbu is one of the undisputed icons of bodybuilding's golden era. Each man represented something different. Arnold with his magnetic charisma and larger-than-life presence, Franco with his relentless grit and raw strength, and Zane with his devotion to aesthetic perfection. Together they defined an era that still stands as the sport's most celebrated period. Without Zane's artistry, the Golden Age wouldn't have had its balance. And yet, his place in history continues to spark debate. Fans still ask, if Frank Zane in his prime walked on stage today under Classic Physique rules, would he dominate the division? Some argue he'd be untouchable, his symmetry and conditioning setting a standard modern athletes can't match. Others believe the sport has evolved beyond him, that physiques today are more polished, more conditioned, and would outshine even Zane's masterpiece. But the very fact that this debate lives on shows the weight of his influence. Legends spark questions that never truly die. Maybe that's the real mystery of Frank Zane. Not how he lost, not why his reign ended, but how his ideas managed to outlive the giants who overshadowed him. In an industry obsessed with size, Zane left behind a philosophy that proved there was something more. Frank Zane didn't just sculpt a body. He carved out a question bodybuilding still hasn't answered. Is it art or just size?